The wind howled like a living thing that night, tearing across the open plains and slamming into the old wooden cabin as if it wanted inside, just as badly as anything else out there. Snow stacked against the walls, creeping higher by the hour, and the cold pressed in through every crack no matter how much firewood burned in the stone hearth. Inside, the cowboy sat alone at his rough-hewn table, boots still on, hat resting beside a chipped tin mug that had long gone cold. Loneliness had a weight to it. He'd learned that over the years, and on nights like this, it felt heavier than the storm outside. He hadn't always been alone. There had been laughter once, a woman's voice, a future he thought would last. But the plains had a way of stripping things down to what stayed and what didn't. The fire popped. The wind screamed louder. And then, through all of it, came a sound that didn't belong. 3 soft knocks, almost swallowed by the storm. He froze. Out here, no one knocked unless they were desperate or dangerous. Slowly he stood, every instinct warning him to stay put. Another knock came, weaker this time. He grabbed his coat, pushed open the door, and the cold punched him in the chest like a fist. There, barely standing in the swirling white, was a woman. Her coat was too thin for a night like this. Snow clung to her hair, her lashes, her shoulders. Her lips were pale, trembling. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just looked at him and said, "Please, I can't feel my hands." Something shifted in him then, something old and buried. He stepped aside. "Get inside," he said. "It's freezing out here." The door closed behind her, sealing out the storm. And for a moment neither of them spoke. She stood near the fire, shaking as warmth slowly returned to her skin. He handed her a blanket. Their fingers brushed, just barely, and the contact lingered, longer than either expected. He told himself it meant nothing. It was just kindness, just a stranger escaping the cold. But as she looked around the cabin, eyes lingering on the worn walls, the quiet, the solitude, something unspoken passed between them. The fire cracked louder, the storm raged on, and somewhere between the silence and the flickering flames, one small, seemingly harmless move began to change everything. If you're drawn into stories like this, stories about choices, chance meetings, and moments that alter lives, make sure you're subscribed. Because this night is only beginning, and what comes next will stay with you long after. The fire burns low. The warmth of the fire slowly worked its way back into her, color returning to her cheeks as the storm continued its furious assault on the cabin walls. But inside, time seemed to stretch and bend in unfamiliar ways. The cowboy busied himself with small, unnecessary tasks, adding a log to the fire that didn't need it, straightening a chair that was already straight, anything to keep from staring too long, anything to keep his thoughts from drifting to places he'd locked away years ago. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and finally spoke again. Her voice steadier now, softer, as if the cold had stripped it down to its truest form. She told him she'd been traveling longer than she meant to, that the storm had come faster than predicted, that she'd seen the faint glow of his cabin and followed it like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, noticing how she chose her words carefully, like someone used to being misunderstood. When she finished, silence settled between them, not awkward, not heavy, just present. He poured hot coffee into a mug and slid it across the table. She smiled, a small thing, but it landed harder than he expected. He realized then how long it had been since anyone had smiled at him like that. Not out of politeness, but gratitude. Outside, the storm roared louder, and for the first time that night, he felt something other than isolation pressing in. She stood and moved closer to the fire, stretching her hands toward the flames, and without thinking, he stepped beside her, close enough to feel the heat off her shoulder, close enough to sense the quiet strength she carried beneath her exhaustion. She glanced at him, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of himself. Not the hardened man the plains had shaped, but the one who still believed that one good choice could change the course of a life. That was when she made the move that neither of them would forget. She didn't touch him. She didn't say anything dramatic. She simply turned, met his gaze, and said, "Thank you for opening the door." In that moment, something cracked open inside him. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to let something warm back in. He understood then that the door he'd opened wasn't just the cabin's. It was one he'd kept shut for years, guarding himself from loss, from hope, from the risk of caring again. The firelight danced across the walls as they talked long into the night. About roads taken and roads avoided, about storms survived and the ones that still lived inside them. The wind eventually softened, the snow slowed, but neither noticed right away. When the storm finally passed, dawn was already hinting at the horizon, pale and quiet. She slept in the chair by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, peaceful at last. He watched over her, realizing that loneliness wasn't always cured by noise or company, but sometimes by one honest moment of connection. When morning came, the world outside was transformed. Buried under fresh snow, sharp and bright, she stood at the door, ready to leave, uncertainty flickering across her face. He didn't stop her. He didn't promise anything. But he said, "If you ever pass this way again, the door's open." She smiled, the same small, powerful smile, and stepped into the light. As he closed the door behind her, the cabin no longer felt empty. The cold no longer felt permanent. And he knew, without a doubt, that one move, one choice made on a freezing night, had changed everything. If this story moved you, if moments like this remind you that small decisions can reshape entire lives, take a second to subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are waiting, and you won't want to miss the next one. The cabin stayed quiet after she left, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the hollow stillness he'd grown used to, not the kind that echoed too loudly in his chest. This silence felt settled, like the land after a storm, when everything is buried under clean snow and the world looks new again. He stood there longer than necessary, hand resting on the wooden door, listening to her footsteps fade into the distance until they were swallowed by the open plains. For years, he'd believed solitude was something you survived by hardening yourself against it, that if you let it touch you too deeply, it would hollow you out. But that night had proven something else. That loneliness wasn't always the absence of people, but the absence of connection. And connection didn't need time or promises to exist. It just needed a moment of honesty. He went about his morning slowly, feeding the fire, clearing snow from the porch, fixing things that didn't truly need fixing. Every task felt lighter, like his body remembered how to move with purpose again. He found the empty mug she'd used still sitting on the table and paused. It was a simple thing, but it grounded him. She'd been real. The night had been real, and so was the change it left behind. As the sun climbed higher, travelers began passing along the distant road again, their silhouettes cutting through the white landscape. Life, it seemed, hadn't stopped while he'd been hiding from it. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like hiding anymore. Days passed. The storm became a story people told in town, something measured by how much snow it left behind. Yet for him, it became a marker, a before and an after. He started riding out more, staying longer when he went for supplies, speaking when spoken to, and sometimes even starting conversations himself. The world hadn't softened, but he had, and that made all the difference. Sometimes late at night, he'd look toward the road, not waiting in desperation, not expecting anything, just open, because he'd learned that doors aren't always meant to stay shut forever. Some are meant to be opened once, at exactly the right moment, to remind you who you are. And if this story reminds you that even one small choice can ripple farther than you ever imagined, make sure you're subscribed. More stories are coming. Stories about moments that change lives when you least expect them. Winter loosened its grip slowly. Like it wasn't ready to admit defeat, the snow melted in uneven patches, revealing the hard earth beneath, dark and patient, waiting to be worked again. The cowboy noticed the change in himself before he noticed it in the land. He woke earlier. He kept the cabin cleaner. He fixed the broken fence out, back instead of telling himself it could wait another season. None of it felt forced. It felt like something had quietly realigned inside him, as if that freezing night had nudged his life back onto a path he'd stepped off without meaning to. He didn't think about her every moment. This wasn't longing in the way he once knew it, but sometimes, when the fire cracked just right or the wind hit the walls in a familiar way, her presence returned like a memory with weight. Not pain, not regret, just meaning. He realized then that some people enter your life not to stay, but to remind you that you're still capable of opening the door. Spring came with mud and movement. Travelers passed more often. He found himself watching the road again, not with expectation but with curiosity. The world felt wider. One afternoon, while trading supplies in town, he heard someone mention a woman who'd been caught in the storm weeks back, who'd said a lone cabin light had saved her life. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. Knowing was enough. That night, back at the cabin, he sat by the fire as the sun dipped low and realized something that settled deep in his bones. The move that changed everything hadn't been hers alone. It had been his willingness to say yes, to warmth, to risk, to letting another human being step into his carefully guarded space. Life didn't transform overnight. It rarely does. But it shifted, and sometimes that's more powerful. Because shifts accumulate, choices stack, and one freezing night can quietly echo through an entire lifetime. If you're still here, if this story is pulling you in the same way that Knock on the Door changed him, take a moment to subscribe. These are stories about moments that matter, about the kind of change that doesn't shout, but lasts.